Red 2 standing by, all 4 lit, and in the green. Welcome back to Goldeneye, where we're heading onto the third mission, which is yet another place James Bond actually hasn't been. This is the silo in Kyrgyzstan. So we have quite a few objectives to complete, and one that was actually cut out of the game. You can still see the remnants of it, but you don't really get to do that much about it. Anyway, we will be having our usual lesson, and we'll be taking on all the difficulty settings of this. So, minimize scientist casualties. Easy enough. Don't shoot the scientists. Our primary objective is to photograph the satellite. Note that it's actually a lot easier on Agent because the timer that is normally set doesn't start going. There is a timer. You can set a timer on Agent if you plant one, and I'll plant one of your bombs and I'll demonstrate that. MI6 has become concerned that unscheduled test firings from a missile silo in Kyrgyzstan are being used to cover the launch of Goldeneye weapons satellites. Deep intelligence reports suggest that this operation may be well outside the control of the former Soviet powers in the region. Infiltrate the silo and ascertain what is being placed into orbit. If it is the satellites, recover their control circuitry and sabotage the launches. You are authorized to destroy the base if necessary. This is a matter of international security, 007. Consider the military personnel expendable. The layout of the missile silo means that a few carefully placed explosive charges will destroy the entire complex. Concentrate on the fuel rooms, H4, C3, K2 and A1. 007, remember to treat the timed explosives with respect. You know what happened to 004 in Beirut? Oh, and get me a picture of the satellite, there's a good chap. You leave at 1800 hours for Bishkek. James, just imagine those romantic nights in the steppes, lying beneath the stars, the campfires twinkling on the hills. Sounds like heaven. When you're in the arms of some dusky maiden, spare a thought for poor old me cooped up behind a desk in rainy London. Let's get to it! To be honest, entire episodes could be devoted to the literary world of 007 as it evolved after the death of Ian Fleming. While the books written after Fleming's death have not quite held the same level of popularity, the works of other authors are nonetheless well worth studying. The majority of these have, in one way or another, maintained elements of connection with Ian Fleming's canon. This was a lot easier in the books set in the era in which Fleming's Bond actually operated. Kingsley Amos's Colonel Sun, Sebastian Faulk's Devil May Care and William Boyd's Solo are all set in the 1960s, while Anthony Horowitz's books Trigger Mortis, Forever and a Day and With a Mind to Kill are set, respectively, in the middle, at the beginning and at the end of the Fleming canon era. John Gardner, on the other hand, decided to bring James Bond into the 1980s when he accepted the task of continuing the literary Bond franchise. While one would assume this would generate a number of issues given the passage of time, after all, even if we stick with "You Only Live Twice" statement of Bond being born in 1924, our hero would be 57 at the time of license renewed. Gardner elected to keep the ages of the characters the same as they were when Fleming's books concluded, as revealed in Raymond Benson's book The James Bond Bedside Companion. The only acknowledgement of the passing of the years is license renewed stating that Bond has a bit of grey hair around the temples. Raymond Benson also chose to acknowledge Fleming's canon, but barring events in the short story Blast from the Past and Never Dream of Dying, along with the occasional returning character, does not rely on it quite as much as some sources. His books also connect with the cinematic canon and update characterizations accordingly. Many critical analyses, including that of Fleming's former literary agent Peter Jensen Smith, considered his work to be very close to Ian Fleming's books. Jeffrey Deaver's Carte Blanche is the odd one out in that it actually brings Bond into a modern setting. He was born in 1979 and is a veteran of the Afghanistan campaign who is recruited into a new agency, neither MI5 nor MI6. It is a rather long book with a very expansive plot involving assassination on behalf of a pharmaceutical group, potential chemical attacks which serve as decoys for the previous element, and a charity organisation manipulating food distribution in Africa to trigger conflicts. It's a bit to take in really, but it does also bring other characters into the modern world. Very few other writers have used a modern take on 007, and if the books have been set in contemporary times, it is the original Bond who appears as some kind of timeless entity. Perhaps the theory James Bond is actually a Time Lord has more weight to it than one originally assumes. After all, Timothy Dalton did play Rassilon, the leader of the Time Lords in the new era of Doctor Who. The only other writer in recent times who has what we would consider a contemporary take on the series is Kim Sherwood, who is writing a trilogy of novels featuring the 00 section and other agents in particular. Some of Fleming's characters and elements of his canon do appear, with both Tiger Tanaka and Felix Leiter having roles to play and Leiter sporting his prosthetics. Otherwise, the existing characters are generally updated and developed. So Miles Messervy is absent, with M in this case being Sir Emery Ware. Q has been replaced with a quantum supercomputer, and Bond himself is notably absent as part of the overarching plot intended for the trilogy. Even works which could be considered spin-offs tend to heed the Fleming canon. A series of novels written by Samantha Weinberg under the name Kate Westbrook, the Moneypenny Diaries, focus on M's secretary and flesh out details for both her and Bond, such as the events in between On Her Majesty's Secret Service and You Only Live Twice. The Young Bond books by Charlie Higson and Steve Cole also make a number of references to Fleming's canon, setting up aspects which would appear in his books. One such example is Bond eventually acquiring the Bentley he drives up until its destruction in Moonraker. He gets this from his Aunt Charmian, who is quite the adventurer and travels across the world on archaeological expeditions. The idea of a youthful Bond had been tried before but hadn't been too well received. These books did manage to find success. Interestingly, they work on the idea that James Bond was born in 1920, whereas we can assume Fleming canon has Bond born in 1924 as of You Only Live Twice. Solo also sticks to the latter birth year. These books also tend to contradict certain elements of John Pearson's James Bond, the authorised biography of 007, though the canon status of Pearson's work does remain contested to this day. The movie novelizations released over time also tended to factor in the Fleming canon as well. Christopher Wood wrote the first two, covering The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. The former diverts from the movie script somewhat by having Fleming's old antagonists Smersh involved, and Bond enduring a torture sequence which feels like a spiritual successor to the one in Casino Royale. Some elements are expanded upon, such as an extended backstory for Jaws, but mostly the film follows the movie. The novelisation of Moonraker was much closer to the movie script, but was not well regarded. The next novelisation would be License to Kill 10 years later. John Gardner wrote this and the next movie novelisation of Goldeneye, but his insistence on keeping Fleming's canon intact bit him in the rear somewhat. In the adaptation of License to Kill, Felix Leiter is getting married again, having been married once before, and said union resulting in a daughter, as we found out in For Special Services. He also has his prosthetic limbs from being fed to sharks back in Live and Let Die, which somehow Sanchez's henchmen miss when they feed Felix to sharks once again. The guy can't cut a break, can he? Thankfully, Goldeneye works a fair bit better, even if it does have a minor continuity quibble given the 00 section was apparently abolished prior to license renewed. Raymond Benson would write the next 3 movie novelizations covering Pierce Brosnan's other films. All 3 followed the movies fairly closely, with a few elements being expanded upon in each case. No other movies have received novelizations. The preceding paragraphs do provide a nice neat microcosm of the books in some ways, but it's well worth getting to know Gardner and Benson's works a little better. As I mentioned, entire episodes could be devoted to this topic, but my goal here is to provide a teaser with my research. Perhaps I can dive deeper in a later episode, but for now, let's have a quick overview. Kingsley Amos's Colonel's Son was published in 1968 under the authorial pseudonym Robert Markham. It's close in tone and style to Fleming's works, drawing on Amos's holidays in Greece for background information to establish the setting. The novel's plot covers the kidnapping of M by the titular antagonist, hired by an ex-Nazi to sabotage and destroy a major Soviet conference. The bodies of Bond and M are to be found there, drawing England into a war against the Soviet Union. The literary 007 would go quiet after this, spending some 13 years in hiatus until the commissioning of John Gardner to continue this arm of the franchise. License Renewed featured Bond investigating Scottish laird Anton Murick and his involvement with various terrorist factions. Murick, an atomic scientist, was infuriated by the rejection of his unique reactor design, which was found to be unsafe, and plans to cause major meltdowns at various nuclear power plants across the world in order to force people to use his design. While the plan partly succeeds in that the reactors are taken over, Bond is able to force the terrorists to surrender before finally dispatching Murick at his castle. Following this is the return of Spectre in for special services and the reveal mentioned earlier that both Felix Leiter, plausibly, and Blofeld, perhaps less so but still possible, were fathers. It's understandable we'd have heard little of Blofeld's personal life. It does feel a little jarring to have a moment of, oh, by the way, Felix was married and had a daughter, but we never heard about her. The book veers into silliness despite the presence of Spectre and a new Blofeld, as their plan involves taking over NORAD headquarters and controlling America's military satellites, sensible enough, with, wait for it, ice cream laced with a drug that makes people much more susceptible to following orders from authority figures. And we thought the plot of the spoof Casino Royale was ridiculous, assuming you've seen it. Oh yeah, and Bond eventually gets to hit on his best mate's daughter. Icebreaker, the third novel, features Bond teaming up with agents from the CIA, KGB and Mossad to destroy a fanatical neo-Nazi who has formed an army of sorts in an attempt to reinstate the Third Reich. The book is notorious for its constant twists and turns, with characters seemingly swapping allegiances or actually being someone else at the drop of a hat. While reviews were somewhat mixed, it's certainly better than the previous effort and does have an interesting subplot drawing on Smersh attempting to get their hands on Bond. Somehow they're still going despite having largely been out of the action since Goldfinger in the normal literary canon. Roll of Honor and Nobody Lives Forever serve as a duology of sorts since both deal with a resurgent Spectre. Bond investigates their operations in the former, having been fired as part of a ruse to infiltrate the schemes of Dr. J. Autumn Holy, a computer programmer who faked his death several years ago and is part of a plan to destabilize both America and the Soviet Union by forcing them to undergo complete nuclear disarmament. However, Holy and his associate General Zwingli are betrayed by Spectre's leader Tamil Rahani, who only intended to make the US disarm and leave the Soviets in power. While the scheme is thwarted and Rahani ultimately escapes via a parachute jump from a plane, an extremely awkward landing badly injures his spine, apparently triggering terminal cancer. Subsequently, the events of Nobody Lives Forever feature a Spectre-organised hunt for James Bond's head, literally. Rahani's intended last request is James Bond's head delivered to him on a silver charger. Many criminals and enemy agents are hunting Bond, even a few traitors, and to make matters worse, Moneypenny and May have been kidnapped. Yes, Bond's housekeeper is still around. Bond is of course able to rescue them and finish Spectre for the last time. Interestingly, Raymond Benson considered it Gardner's strongest book to date, and it certainly does have a tense, engaging feel with many personal elements for Bond. Another Fleming thread, the threat of Smersh, is neatly tied up in No Deals, Mr. Bond. Gardner admittedly thought the title was a bit stupid. The story starts with Bond helping two female agents out of East Germany. 5 years later, we learn those women were part of an operation to serve as honey traps for Soviet agents, encouraging them to defect. The members of the operation, 5 in all, are being hunted and gruesomely murdered, and Bond has to find out who is responsible. While the primary target of the operation, said operation was dubbed Operation Cream Cake and the primary target is named Maxim Small M, let's just make sure I don't get those confused with ambiguous syntax, is originally suspected, Said officer is actually a double agent, and the real mastermind is General Chernov, head of the branch of Soviet intelligence once known as SMERSH and General Grozoboi-Boyshikov's successor. The arrest of Chernov largely concludes SMERSH's involvement in the books in terms of chronological order. Scorpius deals with the eponymous arms dealer Vladimir Scorpius and the cult he has established under the alias Father Valentine. Said cult, the Meek Ones, perform acts of suicide bombing and terrorism against humankind in general, including a number of English politicians. Bond's investigation of Scorpius is actually aided not by an intelligence organisation, but the IRS. An agent of theirs, Harriet Horner, is investigating a credit card company run by Scorpius and its shady dealings. James Bond is bad enough, but being hunted by the IRS? That's terrifying. A scheme to attack the US president is thwarted, and Vladimir Scorpius is, of course, dealt with as you'd expect. He winds up meeting the same unfortunate death Harriet Horner met, being bitten repeatedly and killed by water moccasins. Win, Lose or Die sees Bond promoted to a naval captain, a rank he holds for the rest of John Gardner's books. It also deals with a new nebulous evil organisation, BAST, the Brotherhood of Anarchy and Secret Terrorism, as opposed to the very obvious terrorism, and their plans to take over a Royal Navy aircraft carrier, disrupting a political summit between the British Prime Minister, American President, and Soviet General Secretary. Yes, that would indeed be Margaret Thatcher, George Bush Sr., and Mikhail Gorbachev, respectively. Bond has to deal with several attempts on his life, traitors aboard the carrier, and the machinations of BAST. Gardner had to deal with a critical mauling where this book was concerned for the most part anyway. Broken Claw sees Bond investigating a plot to create a worldwide economic disaster by hacking the New York Stock Exchange and the kidnapping of scientists working on a submarine tracking system and its countermeasure. Both plans are helmed by a Chinese operative who also bears Blackfoot ancestry, Chu-Fu Broken Claw Lee, so named because apparently his thumb is on the wrong side of his left hand. For good measure, he's also quite a powerful gangster who controls drug and prostitution rackets, and literally throws people to wolves. Bond is able to thwart Broken Claw's plans with the help of CIA agent Sue Chi-ho and US Naval Intelligence Officer Ed Ruscia. It does feel a little odd not to have Felix Leiter turning up, and kills the gangster in what is claimed to be a Blackfoot torture ritual, though I cannot yet source any evidence to verify this. The Man from Barbarossa covers the actions of a Russian terrorist group called the Scales of Justice, which has kidnapped a man they believe to be a former Nazi responsible for massacres in the Soviet Union. Bond teams up with agents from Mossad, the KGB, and the French Secret Service, uncovering the plot of the real mastermind. The villain is a Russian general who plans to outfit Iraq with nuclear weaponry just prior to the First Gulf War. The end of the Cold War and a possible coup against the Soviet government, which did happen albeit differently, are also focused upon. While Gardner considered this his best book because he was able to take different approaches among other things, reception was not as strong. Following on from the political themes in The Man from Barbarossa is Death is Forever, focusing on the actions of a former Soviet spy master who is assassinating members of an intelligence network operating in Germany. The ultimate goal of the spy master, Wolfgang Weissen, aka the Poison Dwarf, is to kill the heads of many European nations during the initial journey of the Eurostar, the train which runs through the notable tunnel under the English Channel. The failed coup in the Soviet Union is also referenced as a motivational factor, as Weissen plans to usher in a new era of fanatical communism. He's ultimately dispatched by being electrocuted on the Eurostar's third rail. Never Send Flowers doesn't have a major evil organisation per se, either political or criminal, or at least not much I've been able to find. I admit I don't have this book, and information is kind of scarce. The villain is a retired actor who commits vicious serial killings during fits of insanity and is responsible for several high-profile deaths. This book marks the first appearance of Frederica von Grusser, who would become a major companion for Bond. She would accompany him in Seafire, which dealt with Bond's investigation into Sir Maxwell Tarn's schemes to create a Fourth Reich as well as cause severe ecological destruction. He also dabbles in arms dealing and other shady operations, all that usual villain stuff. Tarn's plan was basically an equivalent of that time a massive oil well rupturing caused the ocean to literally catch fire. Isn't it funny how life winds up imitating art sometimes? Bond once again has bad luck where marriage proposals are concerned, as Frederica is badly injured in the events of Seafire and left in a coma. Gardner's books conclude with COLD, also known as Cold Fall, an acronym title referring to the eponymous evil organisation. Standing for Children of the Last Days, COLD is a terrorist organisation involved with the destruction of an airliner in the first half of the book, an interquel set in 1990, roughly around the time of Broken Claw. A former companion of Bond's, Suki Tempesta from Nobody Lives Forever, was apparently killed in Cold's bombing, though their real target was an anti-terrorist agent. She survives this, then apparently dies in a car bombing, and the second half sees Bond dealing with Cold once more following the events of Seafire. Apparently Suki's death was faked, and she's one of the leaders of Cold just because. Perhaps a somewhat less convincing end to Gardner's tenure. The attack on the United States, it's interesting we're finally having some issues dealing with the United States, as if Fleming's insistence that Britain was the greatest power in the world is finally being forgotten, but still, not a great book all told. Raymond Benson's novels come next, and they treat Fleming's works as canon, but they adapt or ignore elements of Gardner's works as they see fit. Elements from the movies are also worked in along the way, creating an interesting hybrid, because in keeping in line with the Goldeneye's novelisation, we do have the female M in charge. Benson's books do seem to be based on real-world events to a degree, but he also wrote some short stories as well as his novels. Blast from the Past details James Bond finally getting revenge on Irma Bunt, Blofeld's assistant who shared responsibility for Tracy's death, but not before Bond's son James Suzuki turns up. As I mentioned, Kissy Suzuki was for quite some time the only person in the entire series James Bond had actually managed to get pregnant. Either he was really good at practicing safe sex, or I don't know what happened, but unfortunately James Suzuki is just a corpse used in Bond's own revenge scheme, missing a very good opportunity to explore the possible relationship between Bond and his son. The full debut of Benson's novels, 0-10, covers the handover of Hong Kong to China. The book was written a bit before the official handover, so several details ultimately do not match the historical events as a result, but it's kind of forgivable. The main scheme is conducted by Guy Thackeray, who stands to lose his family's long-running East Asia company as a result of the handover. He fakes his death and aims to detonate a nuclear weapon in Hong Kong, presumably to spark a war between the two countries involved. Bond finds the link between Thackeray and a nuclear test in Australia, discovering the full events of his scheme, and yes, the nuclear tests conducted in Australia were very shameful, since the Indigenous Australians really weren't given much opportunity to actually clear the area. He acquires an important document determining the true new owner of Thackeray's company, since Thackeray was intending to hand it over to several mobsters he was working with, and winds up thwarting the detonation, ultimately setting Thackeray to drown in Hong Kong harbour. The Facts of Death deals with an organisation called Decada, masterminding a number of assassinations via chemical and biological weaponry. Bond investigates the mathematical cult, whose members all happen to be vegetarians as part of the group's beliefs, and eventually confronts the head of the cult, Konstantin Romanos. It's probably pretty rare for maths to actually be evil, no matter what a lot of students tell you. The Decada plans to start a war between Greece and Turkey in connection with the ongoing dispute over Cyprus. While Constantine has his own plans, his right-hand woman Hera Volopoulos murders him and takes over the group to try and implement an extra aspect into the chaos. A nuclear weapon is set to be launched in order to trigger the war, but Bond halts that scheme, and also halts Hera's plan to profit from the chaos of releasing a new virus strain the group had engineered. After the short story A Midsummer Night's Doom takes Bond to the Playboy Mansion in order to stop state secrets being sold in a clandestine exchange, earning him the gratitude of Hugh Hefner. Now that feels like a team-up fitting for Bond. High Time to Kill saw Bond go mountaineering in the Himalayas in order to retrieve a top-secret formula for aircraft manufacturing called Skin 17. The main antagonistic force seeking this formula is a criminal organisation called the Union, which is basically Spectre with a new coat of paint as far as I'm concerned. The plane on which the microfilm was being carried, hidden in a pacemaker, winds up crashing and it has to be retrieved from the mountains. Bond also has to deal with his hitherto unencountered rival from his school days, Roland Marquis, who is seeking the formula for his own treasonous ends. All the alternate attempts to acquire the microfilm of the formula are thwarted, and Bond is able to return it to England. However, the Union isn't done with him yet. There is a final short story in between books, Live at 5, a recollection of sorts as Bond muses on the time he helped a Russian figure skater defect in full view of cameras, while he's on his way to a date. After the novelisation of The World Is Not Enough was published, Tomorrow Never Dies novelisation was published fairly early on, the next main novel was released. Double Shot once again sees Bond battling the Union, which has prepared a scheme to discredit Bond and drag Britain into war with Spain. They intend to have an assassin who underwent surgery to look like Bond kill the British Prime Minister and Governor of Gibraltar, and the scheme is overseen by a powerful Spanish gangster and nationalist, Domingo Espada. They're working on the idea that if you meet your double, you're going to die very soon, or some superstition regarding it all. The Union attempts to gaslight Bond and leave him abandoned by all other sources, but with the aid of CIA agent Hilary Taunt, really twins Heidi and Hetty, no that's not Headley, it is Hetty this time, who wind up switching places to keep the guys as Hilary Taunt going, and a little assistance from M, Bond is able to take his double's place and thwart the Union's scheme. He kills not only Espada, but his leading assassin, and the Union's top stealth and surveillance agent, and captures their strategist. Pretty efficient, but things aren't quite done yet. This doesn't sit well with them, and Never Dream of Dying deals with the ultimate showdown against the Union. Bond's attempts to stop one of their operations early on in the book causes unintended collateral damage, resulting in several civilian deaths. This causes a lot of nightmares for Bond because such a thing is, as we've seen, pretty terrifying for him. He doesn't like killing people who have to be killed, and causing civilian deaths is severely traumatic for him. There are unfortunately bigger complications involving these deaths because two of the people killed were the second wife and second daughter of Marc-Ange Draco, Bond's former father-in-law and actually a backer of the Union. With assistance from Rene Mathis, Bond is able to thwart the Union's plan to bomb the Cannes Film Festival and kill a number of royals from various houses across Europe. This scheme, interestingly, was requested of them by one Goro Yoshida, who we'll meet later on. Bond ultimately brings down the Union at their base and finally defeats its leader Le Gérant, aka Olivier Cesare, and a half-brother of Marc-Ange Draco. The latter tries to take Bond down with him but ultimately perishes in the exploding base, unwilling to escape, believing he has nothing left to live for after the death of his second wife earlier on. Yoshida returns in The Man with the Red Tattoo, where he intends to assassinate the leaders involved in the G8 conference with a modified and faster-killing strain of West Nile virus transmitted by mosquitoes. Absolute mongrels, those things. Why do they have a purpose anyway? Since the mission is in Japan, Bond winds up working with Tiger Tanaka once more and investigates the Cure Lab company, run by the McMahon family. It is a target of Yoshida's scheme since a number of traitors have actually been researching not only mosquitoes, but the virus which has been modified and adapted for not only the mosquitoes to transmit, but be able to pass on to their offspring through their eggs in later incarnations. The company is actually to be sold to the Yakuza on the deaths of all members of the McMahon family, so Bond has to protect Mayumi McMahon, the current heir, from Yoshida's machinations. Bond is able to neutralize the mosquito threat with a number of technologies and passes on information to stop the worldwide impact Yoshida intended to bring forth. He ultimately confronts Yoshida in battle after the denouement. When bested with help from Mayumi, Yoshida chooses to commit ritual suicide in accordance with his personal philosophy. While Yoshida's aide believes Bond has been denied the honor from killing Yoshida, Bond simply doesn't care. Yoshida is dead and the threat is negated. After this come the standalone novels and Anthony Horowitz's books. In Devil May Care, Bond investigates the machinations of Dr. Julius Gorner, who is undertaking operations to flood Britain with heroin, before deciding this will take too long to destroy the country and planning to frame England for a nuclear attack on Russia. Bond is also helped by a woman who is actually a fellow 00 agent, but is apparently looking for her sister, who is an invented individual. Fawkes deliberately mimicked Ian Fleming's writing style right down to the manner in which he wrote, being the only author credited as writing as Ian Fleming. And of course we have the typical elements of grotesquerie in the villains, with Gorner apparently having a mutated hand which looks very similar to a monkey's hand. Jeffrey Deaver's carte blanche was discussed earlier, while Solo has Bond on a mission to the fictional country of Zanzirim attempting to stop a civil war. Things go wrong when he is betrayed and apparently shot, left for dead, but the person who shot him was actually a CIA agent, effectively faking his death and making sure he wasn't shot anywhere vital. Bond is given 4 weeks leave and uses those in order to discover the reasons behind the betrayal, the schemes going on, and a plot involving drug smuggling across international borders. It gets a bit fiddly at times, and even then one of the major antagonists isn't quite dead, so it received mixed reviews. It's a bit to get through. Horowitz's trilogy first has Trigger Mortis, which deals with a mission immediately after Goldfinger. Trigger Mortis is a joking phrase involving the self-destruct switch for rocket launches. The US space program's Vanguard launches are to be sabotaged by blowing up the rocket and using weaponry disguised as the destroyed rocket to wreck the Empire State Building. The end result being carried out by the Korean Jason Sin. It's interesting to note that he is Korean, almost as if Anthony Horowitz was deliberately denying the racist attitudes Ian Fleming had, saying, yeah, the Koreans aren't terrible people, Jason Sin's just a terrible person. Basically, the plan is to set the American space race back years and give the Russians control of it. Sin doesn't really care for Smersh's machinations of all, he just wants to carry out his plan. And interestingly, he doesn't appear to have any physical defects, which is quite notable because it's clear we're moving on from those things. Forever and a Day sees James Bond investigating the death of the previous 007 after investigating the machinations of crime boss Jean-Paul Scipio. Scipio is actually somewhat more in line with the Fleming's villains in terms of appearance. He is actually stated to be massively obese, though this is apparently due to having his lymphatic glands severed when his throat was cut as a child. Scipio somehow survived, but was left with massive weight problems. Scipio is working with film manufacturer Irwin Wolfe in order to manufacture massive supplies of heroin. Wolfe's plan is actually to distribute the heroin throughout America, forcing it to draw its attention away from all its pointless, as he sees it, and I probably agree with him, warmongering, and force it to actually take care of its children, creating a number of addicts who will also have a flow-on impact of severely damaging society. Bond is ultimately able to deal with Wolfe and Scipio, or at least their schemes. Scipio himself is stuck on the luxury liner, his massive frame unable to escape, and Wolfe does ultimately have his scheme thwarted but winds up escaping back to America, and the CIA is investigating things in their own way. M's not particularly happy about it, but he acknowledges that Bond has done a good job, and the next mission he has is the one that would be covered in Casino Royale. Then we have With a Mind to Kill, following on from The Man with the Golden Gun. After the assassination attempt on M failed, it was decided that after the death of Scaramanga they would have a funeral for M in order to make the Russians think their plans worked. Bond is allowed to return to Russia in order to smash the organization Stalnaya Ruska, which planned the attempt on M's life. He is able to pretend he still follows the orders of the sinister Colonel Boris and is still under the control of his brainwashing. He is ultimately forced to be involved in a scheme to assassinate Nikita Khrushchev and replace him with a hardline leader who will bring in a much stronger, in their minds, era of Russia. General Griboza-Boyshikov is also involved in this scheme and really wants Bond humiliated and dead. Bond is ultimately able to force himself to throw off further brainwashing, kill Colonel Boris, and ultimately smash Stalnaya Ruska. However, crossing the border between East and West Berlin winds up with a very ambiguous situation. We don't know if 007 is alive or dead. Has he been shot? Is he going to make it back? And if he does, will he retire? We may not find out. Now, I could go on for a very long time with other brief summaries factoring in the Moneypenny Diaries, the Young Bond books, and so forth, but I've probably waffled on a bit long. I do hope this serves as a sufficient teaser for the expanded literary world of 007. Now that I've got this done, it's going to be on with the movies, but in all fairness, I probably should give a brief summary of the Young Bond books. Silverfin covers Bond's early days at Eton and a rivalry with George Hellebore, the aggressive and competitive son of the very demanding Lord Randolph Hellebore. Bond winds up befriending a fellow student named Red Kelly, whose cousin Alfie disappeared in the area. Alfie is actually the boy who was killed in the prologue of the book. Bond and Red attempt to infiltrate Hellebore's castle, which is situated near the eel-infested Loch Silverfin. When Randolph Hellebore discovers them, he holds them captive and reveals that he, along with Dr. Perseus' friend, has been working on a drug to stimulate the endocrine system in order to create super soldiers. Its imperfect form physically warped people, hence the eel-like man who tried to save Alfie in the prologue, Randolph's brother and collaborator Algar. Hellebore steadily perfected the drug, the waste product making the eels in the loch vicious, and used it on George as a guinea pig. Bond is able to escape along with Red, and returns to destroy the lab with the aid of George, who is increasingly fed up with his domineering father. He's really not a bad sort. The drug had warped his personality temporarily, and when he stops taking it, he actually calms down and becomes a pretty nice person. Hellebore's lab is destroyed, and as he tries to kill Bond and George, Algar attempts to stop him. The wound he receives sees the two of them devoured by eels when the brothers topple into the loch. Blood Fever sees Bond on a school trip to Sardinia, where he becomes embroiled in the machinations of Count Ugo Carnifex. The sinister Count has been hiring a number of criminals to aid in schemes designed to assist the Millenaria, an organisation intended to revive the Roman Empire. Sort of a crummier spectre in a way. One of their spoils as such, brought in by a Hungarian pirate, is the sister of a schoolmate of Bond's. While Bond does find her when attempting to infiltrate Carnifex's palace, he cannot rescue her and turns to a teacher for help. Said teacher is actually in league with Carnifex and betrays Bond, who is tortured by being buried and left to mosquitoes. Horrible things, mosquitoes. Bond is rescued by the family of his uncle Victor's servant, and Carnifex is ultimately killed when the pirate he shortchanged floods his palace in retribution. One of Carnifex's enforcers, his sister, does wind up chasing Bond down, but she is ultimately dealt with, as one might expect. Double or Die has Bond following a number of clues left by a kidnapped Eton professor in order to uncover a plot involving a major businessman who is building a supercomputer for the Russians. The trail of clues first leads to another professor who has been murdered before discovering the involvement of Sir John Sharnage, the aforementioned businessman. Bond escapes Sharnage's henchman and infiltrates a disused factory, which actually turns out to be an underground illegal casino. He winds up winning a lot of money on roulette, some of which he is promised by the man for whom he wins the money, before he is captured by Carnage's henchmen and set to be killed. Ironically enough, he is forced to drink a large amount of gin before being thrown into Thames. Bond uses the potassium he stole from the disused factory to escape, creating an explosion, and by chance as he staggers through East London, he comes across the gang led by his friend Red Kelly. Kelly assists him in solving the final clues led by the kidnapped professor, and Bond is able to rescue the professor and destroy Carnage's computer. Interestingly, Bond does not kill the Russian colonel leading the operation. He lets her go, perhaps being unwilling to kill in cold blood, but Colonel Irina Sedova will return. Hurricane Gold, referring to cursed gold that causes misfortune to all those who come into possession of it, sees Bond getting mixed in events surrounding the theft of important documents. While Bond is staying with friends of his aunt's, a criminal gang ransacks their house searching for military plans stolen by the father of said friends, Jack Stone. Bond knocks one of the gang members out the window and is able to help keep Jack's two children, the spoiled Precious and the immature JJ, safe. When they try to contact the children's father, the car is wrecked and the children are kidnapped. Posing as a street thug, Bond is brought into the gang and attempts to save the kidnapped children. As the gang is worn down, JJ's injured leg winds up being infected and he's taken to hospital, and Bond and Precious ultimately escape, but they are pursued by the man Bond knocked out of the window, who is suffering from brain damage and sometimes remembers what Bond did to him, but those memories wind up fading away. Eventually, the head of the gang, Mrs. Theda Glass, decides to sell the plans to the criminal boss El Huracan, with Bond and Precious tailing her to try and retrieve the documents. The only way off El Huracan's island, Lagrimas Negras, which means black tears, is by running a dangerous death course. Those who stay can enjoy a lavish life as long as they have enough money. If they run out, they're reduced to slavery, which is the ultimate fate of Mrs. Glass. Bond and Precious are able to plan out a run of the obstacle course, subject themselves to it, and ultimately escape, though El Huracan had hoped to make Bond a successor. He does keep his word. The last book of Charlie Higson's, by royal command, actually introduces us to Hans Oberhauser. The encounter that Bond mentioned in Octopussy is finally brought up and we see him learning how to ski. When Bond saves a classmate from an avalanche, he is left in hospital near a man we believe at the time to be Graf von Flick. His identity will be important later. On returning to school, Bond becomes embroiled in a communist plot to assassinate King George V at Eton. The Russian agent who is behind the plot of Double or Die, Colonel Sedova, is masterminding this scheme and Bond sees her in the crowd. He winds up stopping the assassination and pursues the would-be killer, a man named Dandy. Bond is saved by the man who tailed him in Austria, who is actually working for MI6 and an associate of one of his teachers, Mr. Marriott, who is also an MI6 agent. He wants Bond to befriend Dandy's accomplice Rowan, who's a maid working at Eton, to try and infiltrate the communist cell. The attempts to do so ultimately lead Bond to discover that the head of the cell is actually Dr. Perseus Friend, who is behind Hellebor's actions in Silverfin. Friend has disguised himself as Von Flick and is actually working for the Nazis. He wanted the prospective perpetrators of the attempt on George V's life to believe they were working for the communists, and the plot on that revelation would ultimately drive Britain to ally with the Nazis and give them a new counterpart to fight the Russians. However, the Russian agents led by Colonel Sedova wind up dealing with Friend and his forces, though Sedova decides she would be better off killing Bond. Rowan winds up saving Bond's life at the cost of her own, and Bond shoots Sedova, though we do not know if this is fatal. While Bond is ultimately shown great gratitude by His Majesty, he is ultimately expelled from Eton, or at least cannot remain there, and is to head to his father's school, Fetz. I've been able to source a bit of information on Steve Cole's books as well, even though info is kind of scarce. Shoot to Kill sees Bond in what was known at the time as Hollywood Land. The land bit has been removed from the sign, so I'm being accurate there. He is investigating the schemes of murderous film director Anton Kostler. The deranged director fell into despair after his wife died and makes snuff films, murdering people on celluloid and working them into his films to show the meaninglessness of life and his control over life and death. This is the first time Bond actually gets compared to Hoagie Carmichael, and he's able to bluff his way through by pretending to be Carmichael's son at one point. Costler intends to take over Hollywoodland and convert the entire industry to his mad schemes. Of course, Bond winds up putting a stop to it. Heads You Die sees Bond dealing with a scientist who took the name Scolopendra after a genus of centipede. Interestingly enough, Scolipede, a Pokemon from black and white versions, is named after Scolopendra as well. Scolopendra is a sinister madman who has developed a deadly virus and infected banknotes with it in order to hold entire countries to ransom. Naturally, because everyone hates Britain, it is to be the first test case. Bond manages to get involved with the broader scheme when he thwarts a kidnapping and winds up encountering Scolopendra's daughter Jaguar, who is trying to stop her maniacal father and is every bit as capable as Bond. The NKVD, a predecessor of sorts to SMERSH, or pretty close to, is behind the scheme, but their agent, La Velada, also known as the Veil, is not dealt with. She wisely decides to get out of Dodge. We also wind up having a henchman who once lost a hand and had it replaced with a block of granite carved into a fist. In fact, his nickname literally means the Fist. A little odd, but it's not too outlandish, really. Strike Lightning has Bond finally enrolling at FETS, where one of his new friends winds up being murdered. From here, Bond investigates and ends up uncovering a plot which involves a British company selling arms to Nazi Germany, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, nothing is ever simple, and the actual plot involves the British actually trying to track down secret Nazi weapon programs and laboratories, and suits of 1930s power armor are involved. Yeah, you heard me right, power armor. Bond's friend was apparently killed in an accident, but he was involved with the project as well. In truth, everyone involved with it is being killed off because the project is allegedly a British scheme, but the manufacturer intends to give it to Germany and everybody has to be bumped off. This kind of feels more like it belongs in a Metroid scan log rather than a James Bond book, really. A form of power armor was in Die Another Day and it was a bit silly there. The final book, Red Nemesis, sees Bond trying to clear the names of his father and uncle, who were actually MI6 agents, against charges of treason and also dealing with a Soviet plot to destroy London. We find out Bond's parents were actually murdered, the real traitor in the organisation killing them for stumbling across his sinister scheme. The ultimate plan is being organised by the traitorous Adam Elmhurst, who helped Bond out way back in Shoot to Kill. The NKVD agent who supported Scolopendra, La Velada, is involved again. Interestingly enough, despite the fact she wears a veil over her face, she doesn't have any sort of physical injury to her face at all. It's a bit of a subversion of the typical Fleming-style villain. Tunnels have been dug under London with special submarines and filled with explosives. When they are detonated, Elmhurst will kill the king, and an agent who is skilled in mimicry, or more accurately, a Brazilian street kid who's really good at vocal mimicry, will pretend to be the king, inviting the Soviet Union to assist and letting them take over England. Bond is able to thwart the plan and ultimately kills Elmhurst, the first time he does so in cold blood, with the gun his father left behind. The gun in question? You might know it. It's a Beretta 418 in a chamois leather holster. The gun Bond uses for the first 5 books of Ian Fleming's stories, of course. And there we go, that pretty much sums up the books. Wow. Fortunately, I had a lot of footage because I spent so long failing on Silo. It took me 2 hours to clear this thing. Thank you very much for listening, and next time we are going to be hearing a bit about the men who would be Bond. Oh, thank God! You think getting invincibility is hard? To give you an idea, there is Dark License to Kill, which is all stats dialed up to maximum in the level editor mode. People can play through the game with this. It was believed that Silo was impossible on Dark License to Kill. To this day, only 4 people have completed it on Dark License to Kill. That's how bad it is. Let's go for the cheat. Oh boy, the worst part about that is the massive tail of guards that follow you like goldfish poop. They'll shoot at you, they'll miss, they'll blow up something explosive, and that'll be it. Anyway, we've got turbo mode. That is basically what you might expect. I'm not going back anywhere near that silo. I'm going to the runway to mess around. So, we move very fast. That's basically what turbo mode is. You have to be very fast to get it. Good old grenade launchers. So yeah, you basically get to move around very quickly. It's kind of fun. It creates a lot of chaos in multiplayer, for example. If you want... Oh, that's right, I didn't put rocket launchers on. If you want, you can basically just put slappers only on, turbo mode, and put the Benny Hill music on. It gets very, very funny very, very quickly. And it's hilarious. I don't really have that much fond to say because at the moment I'm just so frustrated with that level. It was a nightmare. I was explaining it earlier when I actually beat it. It's so frustrating trying to do it because there are so many narrow spots. You need so many things to go right. And it's just painful. It's one of the most painful experiences I've had. I think I finished Invincibility faster than this. Oh my dear Lord. Let's get out of here. But I can say that I did it at long last. I'll have to see how many times it took me in editing. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me. That was frustrating but worth it. Till next time, this is Red 2, returning to base.